Hello everyone and welcome to Stories on the Rooftop. We're delighted to have you here with us today, and wherever you are, we hope you are keeping safe and well. My name is Sabrina Nanji, team member for the Stories on the Rooftop, which is part of the Arts and Culture portfolio of the Aga Khan Youth and Sports Board. Stories on the Rooftop is a platform for sharing personal experiences and engaging in open dialogue with each other. Through these conversations, we seek to enhance our understanding of the diversity of experiences within our community, whilst also connecting with each other to discuss issues that are relevant to all of us. I'm delighted that Munira Wilson will be our speaker today and will take us through her journey to becoming Liberal Democrat MP for Twickenham in the 2019 general election. Before becoming an MP, Munira held a senior level position in a global science and technology company, where she led on Brexit, industrial strategy and health policy. She has also worked for leading children's charities as well as the NHS and has been a councillor in her local community. Before I hand over to Munira, I'll just run through a few logistical points. Munira will start off by sharing her story and we'll have time for questions. You can ask questions by typing in the chat box. Munira is keen to make this interactive and is happy to take questions. So please feel free to type your questions in the chat space at any time and we'll aim to get through them in turn. At the end of the session, we'll have a short evaluation survey, which we'd appreciate if you could complete. Please do switch on your video if you feel comfortable and put your display name as your real name. It's always nice to see faces and know who everyone is. Finally, as I mentioned, Stories is all about sharing personal experiences, and we want to have a safe space for everyone to be able to share their views. So please be respectful when sharing your questions and comment. With that, I'd now like to invite Munira to begin. Thanks, Munira, and over to you.
Hello, and Yali to everybody, and thank you very much for inviting me this evening. As you've heard, I'm Munira Wilson. I got elected as the MP for Twickenham in the December 2019 election. My predecessor here, you may have heard of, was Sir Vince Cable, who was MP for many years here with a 2-year break between 2015 and 2017. But this part of southwest London, I'm pleased to say, is a Liberal Democrat stronghold. So I was delighted when I got selected and then elected, truly humbled. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about my journey and how I came to be an MP, and a little bit about my experiences along the way, and any advice I have for any of you who might be interested in a career in politics. But I will try not to talk for too long. I know on Zoom it's very tiresome to listen to one person for a long period of time, so I'll hopefully speak for about 15 minutes or so, and then very happy to take questions. So if I think back to my childhood, I think I was brought up in a household where there was quite a keen interest in current affairs and international issues. But also I would say I was very much brought up by my parents with the value of looking out for those who are less fortunate than me. We all were. And, you know, like many others, I'm sure on this call, brought up with the value of seva or service and serving others. And I guess, therefore, when I think about how sort of, later on in life I got into politics, even though I wasn't from a political family, I can see where some of those values and drivers come from in terms of the environment that I was brought up in, and the values that my parents and sisters talked about. So, anybody can have that desire to serve and want to help others, and you can do that in many different ways. So why politics? Well, when I was at school, when I did my A-levels, I did A-level British government and politics, partly because I needed a third subject and I didn't really know what to do. I was doing languages, and politics was an option that was available at the school I was at. And partly because of this interest in current affairs. And that's when I really got the bug and was interested in politics. And if I think back, I think there was a time when I was doing A-level politics and I thought to myself, actually, being an MP sounds really cool. I'd love to do that. But didn't really think more about it after I'd done my A-level. I went off to university and I studied modern languages at university. I didn't get involved as many politicians do. I didn't start my political career at university. I wasn't politically active. It was only after I graduated and I'd started a graduate career in one of what was then the big 5 accountancy firms, and was getting more and more annoyed. It was the time, some of you may remember, it was the time of the Iraq War back in 2003, when the UK government had decided to go to war in Iraq, which was very, very controversial. And I was angry about that. And there were a number of other issues at the time to do with Europe, to do with education, to do with the environment and the importance of the environment. I think that's when, in my consciousness, I became much more aware of things like climate change and the impact that we human beings were having on our environment. And I felt the Liberal Democrats were speaking to my beliefs and values on many of these issues. And as I say, I was getting quite angry. And I distinctively remember a good friend of mine said to me, "Munira, stop shouting at the television, get off your backside and go and do something about it." So that's when I joined the Liberal Democrats, and I was in a part of London. I mean, I grew up in Golders Green, and at this point I was in Finchley, where the Liberal Democrats were very, very weak. The local party was just a few members. And so as I was bored in my job, I was being trained to be a tax consultant. And to be honest, it wasn't very interested in what I was doing. I realised then that I'd quite like to go and work in politics as part of a first stepping stone to potentially a career of my own in politics. And I applied for various jobs with MPs, and I got a lucky break because I'd never really volunteered or worked as an intern in the political sphere. And I got a job, not in Parliament, but in constituency, working for a then Liberal Democrat MP down in Guildford. And although I had no campaigns experience, at the interview, people spotted in me a political instinct and an interest and an ability and willingness to learn. And I got offered a job as a campaigns organiser for at that point, one of the most marginal seats in the country, to run the general election campaign to hold the seat for the Lib Dems in 2005. And that was a very, very steep learning curve, as I'm sure you can imagine. The experience will be scarred on my soul forever because we lost the seat by 347 votes. But that, sad to say, as a Liberal Democrat, it's part of building the resilience, because sadly we're not as successful as I'd like us to be. So you have to get used to losing as much as you have to get used to winning. But anyway, that's when I first cut my campaigning teeth down in Guildford in the 2005 election. I then moved back to London and decided to move to southwest London, where the Liberal Democrats are much stronger, partly for personal reasons, because by this point I'd met my now husband through the party, and he'd got a job working for Twickenham and Richmond Liberal Democrats, and also because I wanted to start building my own political career and run to stand for council, and there was a much better chance of getting elected here in the London Borough of Richmond upon Thames as opposed to the London Borough of Barnet, which is where I was from. So that's how I sort of took my initial steps into politics. And then, obviously that was back in 2005 and we're now in 2021. So there's a huge amount that's happened in between. And it's been, it was a long road between first getting involved in the party in 2003 and getting elected in 2019. So when I came to Twickenham, I then briefly went to work for Nick Clegg, who some of you will remember was the leader of the Lib Dems, became Deputy Prime Minister during the coalition government. He was a new MP. I worked for him briefly in Parliament, but then I took my political experience and went to work in the policy and public affairs world, first in the charity sector, then moving into the corporate sector, whilst using my spare time outside of my paid full-time job to get much more active in politics. I stood for council here in Twickenham in 2006 and got elected as a councillor in 2006 for the Liberal Democrats in West Twickenham. And then I also started the process of becoming an approved parliamentary candidate. And every party has its own internal processes of how you become a parliamentary candidate. Once you go through that process, if you get approved and you're on the list, then you try and find parliamentary seats that you want to fight. And back then I tried for 1 or 2 seats in London, fought some competitive selection campaigns, sadly didn't get selected for somewhere that was more winnable, because at the time Vince Cable was the MP here and was quite clearly going to be the MP for some time. And I decided to actually put my roots down here in Twickenham, fought an unwinnable seat next door in Feltham and Heston. I actually stood down from the council after 4 years because I'd moved into the corporate world. My career was taking off outside of politics, and I wanted to make sure I did whatever I did, whether it was being a councillor, whether it was being a parliamentary candidate, that I gave it my all. So in 2012, I stood in my area for the London Assembly elections for South West London. This was all part of sort of building my CV and credibility to be able to run for Parliament eventually, as many politicians do. And then in 2015, obviously, the Liberal Democrats had a pretty disastrous general election result following the end of the coalition government, when we went from about 52 seats down to only 8, and even my local constituency of Twickenham here, Vince Cable lost his seat. So, by this point, I'd had my first child, my corporate career had taken off, I was in management position. So actually, I took a step back for a while and focused on my day job, building up my career. Went to work briefly in the NHS and then moved back to the corporate sector in a more senior role, and had our second child. And then, you know, so much of politics is circumstances and timing. With all the shenanigans that we had over Brexit, when it became obvious we were going to have a snap general election in 2019, I went and had a chat with Vince and said, "Are you going to be standing again?" And he said, "No." And I thought, well, this is my opportunity. With 2 young children and a busy corporate career, I'm not going to be able to be a parliamentary candidate for a constituency where I've got to commit myself for 2 years before a general election. But if we have an election in a few months, actually, I can take that hit for a few months. And with all of the work that I'd put in over the years in the local area, I was known by a lot of the members. I had the track record on the council and having stood for the GLA and for another parliamentary seat. And, you know, I went through for selection with 2 other candidates and was overwhelmingly selected by the local membership as the candidate for Twickenham. And then was massively humbled to win with a 14,000 majority in December 2019. I was asked to touch on barriers. You know, I very often get asked, particularly as a woman and an Asian woman, did you face barriers as a woman? Did you face barriers, you know, as an ethnic minority? I personally don't feel I've ever at any point faced any overt discrimination, either because of my gender or my ethnicity. Obviously, I don't know if there have been things under the radar. Actually, I've only ever had a lot of support, encouragement, people who've mentored me and coached me to get to where I've got to. You know, being a politician, you have to show lots of confidence, be able to get up and, as I did today, challenge the Prime Minister in the House of Commons. Yet many stages of my journey, I've had very, very low self-confidence, and I've looked to mentors and coaches and others who've helped me get over those barriers, but those were, I guess, personal barriers as opposed to things that other people had put up. I've actually been very strongly resistant in the party and outspoken to positive discrimination measures like all women shortlists or all ethnic minority shortlists. I personally believe that we should be getting there on merit with hard work and determination. And I didn't want anybody to ever look at me and say, well, you're only there because you're a woman or because you're brown. As it happens, because of the diversity challenge the Liberal Democrats have traditionally had, the Twickenham constituency was selected on an all-women shortlist, much to my dismay. And so I only fought against women for the Twickenham seat. And I think it would have been a more competitive fight if some of the men had been able to stand in the local area. But I mean, that's another story. But I personally don't feel I've felt those barriers along the way. Actually, I think the biggest barriers, particularly in one of the smaller parties like the Liberal Democrats, are time and money. The biggest sacrifice I've had to make over the years is social life, time with my friends, time with my family. And also it's flipping expensive standing. Obviously you don't draw a salary until you get elected. I mentioned before, the only reason I was able to stand in 2019 was because it was a short-term commitment generally to be able to win a parliamentary constituency for the Liberal Democrats, you have to be able to dedicate 2, sometimes 3 years to being the parliamentary candidate for a winnable seat. And that requires at some point probably going part-time in your work, which means obviously sacrificing salary. You also have to raise tens, hundreds of thousands of pounds to be able to run your campaign. There isn't, a big cash point in the sky or party HQ that's giving you the money. You have to raise the money. I mean, I got selected in September 2019, and between my selection in September 2019 and getting elected in December 2019, I personally went out and raised £50,000 just to run my campaign. And there are lots of people who as candidates will also put in their own money if they can afford to do that. I took unpaid leave. I was fortunate we were in a position to do that financially for a number of weeks. But, I'm the main breadwinner in the family. And so, but I was fortunate to do that. There are many people who can't do that. So for me, the barriers were not ethnicity or gender, but money and time potentially, if it hadn't been a snap general election. My advice to anybody who's thinking about getting involved in politics or getting active on any issue, because frankly, being active and political doesn't necessarily mean joining a political party. It might be that you're passionate about climate change. It might be that you're passionate about violence against women. It might be that you're passionate about various foreign affairs issues, and there are all sorts of obviously single issue groups out there that you can get involved in. But if you if you are interested in getting involved in politics, my advice is actually there's plenty of time, and I think back to my story when as soon as I got politically active, I was all really driven and wanted to get selected as a parliamentary candidate. Actually, I'm really glad that circumstances meant that I didn't get selected as a parliamentary candidate back in 2008, 9, and that I didn't run in the 2010 election for a winnable seat. I'm really glad that it therefore meant that I went and built a career outside of politics. My learnings from being a senior leader in business have stood me in great stead for becoming a parliamentarian, both as a candidate where I had to build a team very, very quickly who were going to help me run my campaign on the ground, for recruiting volunteers, for now managing a team in Parliament where I've got a small team working for me. All of those skills that I learned from the corporate world have really stood me in good stead, not to mention the network I've built up along the way. I talked to you about the need to fundraise, and I have to keep fundraising to be able to fund my local campaigning activity and additional staff, because parliamentary allowances don't pay for very many staff. My network over the years, there are people I met back in 2004 who are still part of my network, and people who supported me back then and thought I'd make a great MP, and business contacts that I've developed over the years who are sympathetic to the cause or to my to me being an MP, who now support some of my work financially. So for me, actually, that experience and that network is invaluable. So and never let any experience or opportunity along the way go to waste, because most times I can think back to and think, actually, that particular experience or that individual has helped me or influenced or shaped my path in some way. So that would be my biggest piece of advice. And I've already talked for too long, so I'll pause there and open up for questions.
Thank you so much, Munira. I've had some questions come through. The first one is, what do you think are the most important issues facing the United Kingdom today? And if you were in charge, how would you propose we address one or two of these key issues?
Well, obviously, in the wake of the pandemic, I think the state of the economy is probably the biggest issue, and of course the NHS and the massive backlog. So the fact that I think when furlough comes to an end later this year, we're going to see, I mean, we've already obviously seen an increase in unemployment, but I'm really worried that that's really going to go through the roof later this year, and particularly youth unemployment's been massively impacted. So that, as well as in terms of now and longer term, the biggest issue I think facing us, and not just UK but globally, is climate change. And so actually, I think as part of our recovery, we need a green recovery package where, you know, the government's promised to spend billions on infrastructure. Frankly, they need to spend a hell of a lot more and put it into green infrastructure, insulating our homes, investing in renewable energy, investing in rail, trying to cut domestic flights, because then you're tackling the climate emergency. You're also creating high-skilled jobs at the same time, working hand in hand with the private sector. So that's what I would do in terms of jobs. And in terms of the NHS, I mean, the waiting lists are huge. I'm sure there's many on the call here who work in the health sector and will know far better than I should say I'm the Liberal Democrats health spokesperson, so it's an issue that I'm looking at just in terms of the diagnostic and the screening backlog, as well as elective care. And I think in the short term, it probably needs an injection of cash with working with the private sector, but I think longer term it will need quite a different way of thinking about how we reconfigure services at a local level to be able to work more efficiently to get through that backlog. But sadly, it won't be solved without a lot more cash, which is easy to say, and obviously is controversial potentially in and of itself. But we saw in the Blair years that those waiting lists were only brought down with massive injections of cash.
Thank you.
And workforce, I should say. Sorry. I mean, you can have lots of money, but if you don't have the doctors and nurses, and we know there's huge numbers of vacancies, there needs to be a major workforce strategy to help the NHS.
How do you deal with the pressure, day-to-day pressure of the job, and deal with people potentially not liking you or your policies?
Yeah, it's exceptionally busy. I mean, indescribably so, and particularly with COVID. I mean, nobody had any inkling when I got elected in December 2019 that my first year as an MP would be facing a global pandemic. And so it was already, as you can imagine, I was like a rabbit in headlights and completely overwhelmed just in those first 3 months. And then the pandemic hit. I was, you know, not, as well as the constituency workload, which just went up at least tenfold overnight, with literally, and I'm not exaggerating, thousands of people emailing me, thousands of constituents emailing me every single week. As health spokesperson, I was having to respond to media inquiries about everything that was going on every day with the pandemic, and when Parliament reopened, challenging Matt Hancock week in, week out, every time he made a statement on coronavirus. So I'd say from March last year till about January this year, I mean, it was just off the scale. And there were times in the first lockdown when I was probably working 15 hours a day, 7 days a week. And it was hard. Thankfully, it's not quite as intense as that, although it is still pretty busy. How do I cope? Well, there's only one answer to that, and that's Michael Wilson, my husband. He is, you know, he's absolute star, and without him I couldn't do it. I mean, he is the primary carer for our children. He keeps the house running. I mean, he's my house husband who enables me to do this, and I couldn't do it otherwise. And that support, I mean, is invaluable. Yeah. Oh, and I go running every so often. That keeps my mental health in check. Otherwise, I would actually go crazy. And if it weren't, I only manage maybe a couple of 5K runs a week, but I absolutely need that for my sanity.
What was the first thing you did once you heard you had won?
I was trying not to cry. I get quite emotional, particularly because it's been such a long journey, and I felt so called to doing this. It was I actually knew before the result was declared. Obviously, I knew some hours before. So my agent, who was at the count, phoned me as they were opening the ballot papers and checking them. Every party is able to send a team of people to watch the count, and my team were there, and they could see just from the opening of the ballot papers and the samples they were seeing that I'd won comfortably. So I got a call from my agent, probably I think maybe around midnight or so, that I had won, so I managed to get maybe 2-3 hours sleep. And then at the count, I guess it was a mixture of feelings, because yes, I was elated that I'd finally achieved this thing that I'd been working towards for 16 years that I felt deeply called to doing. But at the same time, it was another horrendous night for the Liberal Democrats, having expected to do much better. And so I was sort of devastated that I was going to be one of only a small number, whilst delighted that South West London had turned gold entirely, because I'd held Twickenham. My neighbour in Richmond Park had just won her seat from the Conservatives, and Ed Davey, my other neighbour in Kingston Surbiton, held on to his. So we had our little Liberal Democrat haven in South West London, but sadly not enough of the country turning gold. So it was a mixture of emotions, but I can only, the biggest thing I would say was just humbled. I never expected to win by such a margin. And I really felt the gravity of the responsibility that was given to me. I take it very, very seriously. For me, it was a huge honour, massively humbling. And that's why it was quite difficult to hold my emotions in. You can Google my acceptance speech somewhere and you'll hear my voice cracking.
Please, could you describe the average day in the life of an MP?
Oh, God. That is quite hard to do. If I give you a flavour of all the different things an MP has to do, it's hard to give you an average day, because different days are different, whether they're Parliament days or constituency days. But I'll try and chunk it up. So most people think about MPs being in Parliament on the green benches, spouting a lot of hot air at each other. That's actually only a small percentage of what we do. But an important one. And even if I'm just asking a question, that will still require quite a lot of prep and thought in terms of all the issues that are going on, what other people who might be called before me might ask, and what angle I want to take, and how to get my question really crisp and clean. Or obviously if you're speaking in a debate, that requires more work in terms of drafting and producing speeches. And I have a researcher in Westminster who does all the research for me and will produce me a briefing, but I tend to draft my own speeches, or ad-lib them, as I sometimes have come to do and have had to learn to do. So that's the parliamentary bit, but that's just one smallish chunk of what we do. I don't actually, sorry, I should have said, because obviously a big part of being a parliamentarian is legislation and passing legislation. Because we're quite a small group in terms of Lib Dems, we don't necessarily get into what are called the bill committees, where you analyse and scrutinise every piece of legislation clause by clause, because we just don't have the numbers. So we tend to participate in all the big debates on the legislation, but it tends to be Labour and the Conservatives and SNP who get into all the nitty-gritty line by line scrutiny. So that's Parliament. Then there's all the constituency work. So I talked to you about the thousands of emails. I mean, to give you a flavour, in my first year as an MP, my office and I dealt with 20,000 emails from constituents. And that will have been on a wide range of local and national policy issues, from why don't we have public toilets on Twickenham Green, to what are you doing about climate change, or what are you doing to protect food standards in the trade bill. So you get thousands of emails, that some are campaign generated by NGOs and charities, and some that are just individuals who want to express their view to you and want to know what your views are on any given issue. And obviously many of those were coronavirus related, to do with government policy on either health or the economy, or why certain things were open, why schools weren't open, or why schools were shut, or why do we have to wear face masks in schools. So we've had all of that. So that's just some of the policy correspondence. Then I have constituents coming to me with issues such as, I'm having trouble accessing my benefits, I've got a visa issue for a family member, or I'm in overcrowded housing, or it's a council related issue, but they've come to me like they want to, they're unhappy about a planning issue, or they want to appeal a parking ticket. So all of that I put in a bucket called casework, and I have a caseworker who helps me, who will work through those issues. But I will also hold surgeries where members of my constituents can come book appointments and meet with me. Normally it would be face to face. Through the pandemic, we've been doing them virtually. So that's the individual constituents. Then the other part of being constituency MP is going out and about on visits around the constituency. Again, that's been massively curtailed in my first year because of the pandemic, but it's starting to pick up again. So this week I went to visit a secondary school on Monday morning. I will go and visit businesses, charities, other voluntary and community groups. I'm going to visit Teddington Rugby Club on Sunday morning. You know, all sorts of things. Schools will invite me to events that they're putting on. You know, concert bands will invite me to their events in the summer. Hopefully, if things are starting to open up again, summer fairs, all that sort of thing. So that tends to also take up my time at weekends as well. What else is there? And then obviously I, as health spokesperson, I have to work on national policy issues and feed into sort of policy making processes within the party, and also come up with, you know, whatever our line is going to be on any given health issue that's prevalent in the day. And then there is the, you know, the pure party political work that I have to do. So whether that's engaging with my own local parties at events, but also I get invited by local parties all around the country to speak at their dinners and AGMs and other social events. Thankfully, because it's all virtual at the moment, it means I can be, you know, in Cornwall one day and in Warrington the next, and it's all easily done. But I mentioned as well fundraising, knocking on doors. We've just had elections. I've spent a lot of time being out on the doorstep with local candidates, knocking on doors. So all of that together, and as I mentioned before, managing a team. People forget that as an MP you're also a manager. It's like, you know, running your own small business almost, and you've got a small team. I've got about 5 people who work for me, and managing and motivating them and dealing with some of the HR issues that you have to deal with in any business or other organisation. People forget that we have to do that as well, and actually there's lots of politicians who aren't very good at that, depending on their background. So that's why notoriously you hear about all sorts of terrible stories of MP behaviour. But that's a flavour of all the different things. So it's not a day in the life of, but any given day will be a mixture of all of those things. And the shape of the week is Parliament sits from Monday afternoon and until about Thursday afternoon. And being a London MP, obviously I'm able to do constituency things Monday morning, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and quite often in the evenings as well.
Wow, so really, really varied on a day-to-day basis.
It's varied and exhausting, but wonderful.
What are your future aspirations, and do you have any short and long-term plans for your career and for personal growth?
What are my future aspirations? Well, the problem is, as a Liberal Democrat, if I'm being really candid, the chances of, you know, of us ending up as a majority government are pretty slim. So I guess, if I'm really honest, I hope that one day we can be holding the balance of power and there may be an opportunity to serve in government. I'm passionate about children's issues. I'm doing a lot of work on children's mental health as health spokesperson. And I would love to be children's minister in government if that opportunity ever arose. But if not, I think, you know, even as a backbench MP, not in government, you can do lots of useful and interesting things and run campaigns on issues and make change, particularly working cross-party. So for me, in terms of growth and development, I think the last year I've just been so focused on coronavirus. It's taken up all my energy and all my time. I'm just loving the fact that I can look up from that a bit now. As I say, starting to focus more on children's mental health. I've been doing more work on environmental issues as well. Not just because it's important to me, it's particularly important to my constituents. And obviously they want to feel they've got a representative who's doing work on that. So I don't have a specific personal goal in the next year or so. I think my main goal is to make sure I get re-elected in whenever the next election is. but also to make sure that I get more Liberal Democrats elected so that we can actually have a bit more influence in Parliament, because it's pretty lonely with just 11 of us, and it just means the workload is that much bigger because there's only 11 of us covering everything, and just having a bigger team would be wonderful. So it's my mission to win my seat, frankly, in the next year, and make it as safe as possible so that I can go and help get Liberal Democrats elected elsewhere, and then we can have more influence.
What tips do you have for keeping track of all the new contacts you have met and the various different people that you've come into contact with?
Gosh, I wish I could tell you that I was super organized at this, but I'm really not. I hate process of any sort, which is why I have to make sure I've got people who do process in my team. Otherwise I would get very unstuck. I guess in terms of contacts and connections, I haven't had a systematic way of doing it. As just people that I've managed to stay in touch with through social media or just via phone and email. I mean, I don't have a more structured answer, but it's just, people I've met along the way. I mean, as I say, I think back to when I was, totally, fresh-faced, brand new, approved parliamentary candidate, trying to get selected as the Lib Dem candidate for Streatham back in 2006, I think it was 2006, and I didn't win, but I got an incredibly good result given that I'd come from nowhere and nobody knew me in that particular patch. And the guy who was the returning officer for the Lib Dems for that internal party selection, I'd never met him, but he was so impressed with my selection campaign. He just said, look, if you ever want any help, let me know. We're still friends today. He's somebody who's given donations to my campaign, but also given me loads and loads and loads of strategic advice through the years, which has been invaluable. And they're the sorts of contacts I've just picked up along the way. And then make sure that you occasionally call them up or go for a coffee with them or go for dinner. And networking, it's what the world runs on.
Who in world affairs, in the UK or abroad, in or out of politics, do you admire and why?
Who in world affairs? Well, I mean, I've always been a massive fan of Barack Obama, as you can imagine. But I was also really inspired when obviously Kamala Harris got elected with Biden, not least because it was fantastic that that awful man Trump had gone and his politics, but also obviously because she was the first vice president who was a woman and an ethnic minority, and that for me is massively inspirational. And I think see her and breaking glass ceilings, and I think that's what's going to inspire me to go on and hopefully do bigger and better things if I get the opportunity.
Moving on from that a little bit, I suppose, how do you feel about the government's recent findings and conclusions regarding institutional racism?
Well, okay, that's a controversial one. So I struggle with this one because I think my view is that they overlooked a lot of what our lived experience is and looked at things through a particular lens. They already knew what outcome they wanted to get. On the other hand, I think there are parts of the political classes who also had a particular view that they want to push and don't like, aren't interested in debate. I think the truth is somewhere in between. I think what that report said was actually poverty and inequality is a massive driver of some of this discrimination. I absolutely agree with that, but you can't deny the fact that there is some discrimination that is based entirely to do with the colour of your skin, and some of that is institutionalized. I don't think some of the very shrill voices from the left help, and I don't think those on the right who deny any of this stuff exists helps. And so that's why I think, like with so many other reports. My problem with all of this is that we've had report after report after report about discrimination and prejudice in the criminal justice system, in the police. We had the Windrush scandal report. We've had all of these reports and then no action. I see this as another piece of evidence to add to that weight of reports. Now, what I want to see is some action to tackle some of those issues.
Thank you. When you go on question time, do you get all the questions in advance?
Well, I've only been on question time once, and that was a shock to me. Frankly, it's very unusual for a brand new MP to be invited onto question time, but because it was all pandemic dominated last year, the press office phoned me up and said, how do you fancy going on question time next week? And I tried my best to talk them out of it and to get them to try and find somebody else. I was like, you are joking. Like this, I said to my husband when I got elected, I'm never going on question time. And he's like, you will, you will, you will. And of course he was right, and various people talked me into it. But no, you don't get the questions in advance. But I work with the Lib Dem press and policy team, and you can usually take a fairly educated guess as to what the topics are that are going to come up, and work through what your talking points will be, and adapt them accordingly. So I've only done it once, and I did Any Questions, which is the radio version, a few weeks ago. I think it was on Good Friday I did that.
For anyone young people who are thinking of going into politics, what are the main qualities you think someone needs to be able to get there, and how would people work on those qualities?
Resilience, tenacity, willingness to roll your sleeves up and do an awful lot of hard work, but also, have fun. I mean, I made it sound terribly hard work, but it is fun as well. I mean, there is nothing like the high of a big campaign when you've got, you're part of a massive team of people that is out there, knocking on doors, delivering leaflets and talking to people, and especially when you win. I mean, even when you don't win, that team and that camaraderie, it is great fun. The thrill of the chase and in an election. So obviously you've got to work out what your beliefs and values are in terms of which political party you want to align yourself with, but also you have to come to accept that you will never agree with everything a political party stands for. So it's being comfortable with some level of compromise in terms of some issues that you may not agree with some of your colleagues on, but also developing a thick skin. I've just realized I didn't answer part of an earlier question, but I guess it comes in here, and I just talked about resilience. You won't be liked universally. That's the nature of politics. So there are people who disagree with me violently on things. And frankly, I don't object to people disagreeing with me on policy matters. If it gets personal and are rude to me on a personal level, that I do object to. But actually, I have no problem if someone's going to be quite terse with me about a policy issue. It's just, there are different people who have different views in the world. I don't know how you work on resilience. I think that's something you build over time through experiences, rejections and successes and failures along the way. But it's about picking yourself up and I guess learning from those. How I said before that if I think back to when I started my political journey, and even before that, every experience I've had has taught me something along the way, and you probably don't realize it at the time. And sometimes you're going through something and you just think, actually, I have no idea why I'm doing this. It's not adding any value. But you with the passing of time, you can look back and draw things from it that all add to that experience for moving forward.
Thank you. We've got a couple of questions linked to the actual politics. So after the SNP success in the Scottish Parliament, do you see a case for the independence referendum? And what are the Lib Dems doing to prevent a disunited community?
Is anybody tweeting this? I have to be careful what I say. So I think, well, look, every unionist party, and Liberal Democrats are a unionist party, right? We strongly believe in a United Kingdom, and the Scottish and Scotland being part of a United Kingdom. However, we have also always been the party of devolving power down to the lowest level, and we've always therefore been a party of devolution, and we were strongly in favour of Scotland having its own parliament, and we would even potentially give Scotland and Wales more power still, but still be part of a sovereign United Kingdom. However, all unionist parties since the results last weekend have been avoiding answering the question, which I think, frankly, is inevitable now when you look at the numbers, that at some point there will have to be another independence referendum. Whilst we'd love to avoid it, we saw the bitterness and division caused by the first independence referendum and the bitterness and division caused by the Brexit referendum. It pains me to think we're going to have to go through that again, but talking to my Scottish colleagues, it is a divided country. The whole election was just about independence, and as much as we wanted it to be about the recovery post-pandemic, frankly, it was just about the independence. And I think I would like to think the only way you're going to lance that boil is by another referendum, but everybody thought that was going to be the case with Europe. And we had all that wrangling over Brexit, and still there is, because we're still seeing the fallout of that, right? And we'll feel the impact for many years to come. But sadly, I think the numbers mean at some point it will be inevitable that we will have one. But I don't think that's the official party position, so probably best you don't tweet that.
How has working cross-party on health and social care differed during the pandemic to normal times?
So it's quite hard for me to say what's different versus in pandemic versus normal times, because I haven't had much by way of normal times. Remember, I got elected just before Christmas in 2019. And we started having the first statements in Parliament in late January about coronavirus when the situation was unfolding in China. And by March, we were in lockdown. So actually, working cross-party has been really difficult because we haven't been in physically to make those connections informally and chat to people. Everything's been virtual. So yes, I've been able to attend various virtual cross-party meetings, like there's the all-party parliamentary group on coronavirus that I'm a member of, that's been taking evidence from lots of experts and putting forward recommendations to government when the government wouldn't start an inquiry quickly. And that's been great, but I can't really give you a flavour of what it's been like working cross-party, because I've not been able to do it much in any meaningful way, to be honest, other than these rather stilted Zoom calls. But I hope we can do more of it. I really do, because many of these big issues, particularly something like social care, which we've seen the government avoid yet again in this week's Queen's speech, despite Boris Johnson saying he was, on the steps of Downing Street, this was a big issue that he had a plan for and was going to resolve. Frankly, social care is a massive toxic political football, because it's going to be so expensive to fix properly, and that needs to be done cross-party. We have for many years advocated a cross-party approach. So I really hope that government come good on their promises and actually approach Labour, Lib Dem, SNP, although obviously it's a different system in Scotland, so probably Labour, Lib Dems, to come up with some sort of solution where we can, I guess, jointly own the toxicity of the solution.
And we've got lots and lots of questions, but we are coming to the end now. So we're just going to go with the last one, which is, what do you do to have fun?
What do I do to have fun? Well, I was just saying to my husband the other day, it's been too long since I've gone and had a proper dance somewhere. I mean, I love dancing. My family will tell you I love to take over the dance floor. Not that I've been out clubbing for many, many years, particularly being a mother and being in politics. I don't have time for that sort of thing. But I dance around my kitchen, I suppose. And as I said, I go out for runs when I can. But yeah, I haven't been out and partied for a long time, and that's what I'd like to do at some point when lockdown eases, just go and let my hair down.
I think there's lots of people who'd love to do that too. Thank you so much, Munira, for joining us today and for sharing your journey. I've thoroughly enjoyed listening to your insights into Parliament and what your life is like.
Yeah, I hope I haven't bored you all to tears.
No, definitely not. No, definitely not. There are so many more questions. I don't know if you can see the chat as well. There are.
I mean, I was assuming you wanted me until 9 o'clock. So although I'm absolutely famished, I don't mind taking a couple more, and I'll just.
If you are, that would be great. There are a couple more if you can see.
I told Michael I'll be down at 9, so I'll go and eat my cow sag at 9 o'clock.
Okay, brilliant, excellent. So we can take a couple more then. That's great. So we've had a couple of questions about satires like Thick of It and Yes Minster and Spitting Images. How accurate do you think that they are? Well,
having never been in government, I can't quite tell you what it's really like behind closed doors in government. I suspect there's definitely more than a shred of truth in them because they, otherwise they wouldn't have been made. So obviously, I think they are exaggerated somewhat. And certainly when I worked for NHS Digital, which is a national NHS organisation, I did have, because I was the level I was working at, I did have some ministerial meetings in the Department of Health at the time. And although I wasn't party to some of those experiences, I heard from colleagues about some of the behaviours between ministers and civil servants. And actually, when I talked to some of my Liberal Democrat colleagues who, or friends who served in government during the coalition years, some of the sort of Sir Humphreys of Yes Minister, I think does strike a chord in terms of some of the civil servants, but obviously a lot of it is exaggerated. I'm sure, I think the thick of it was sort of modelled on Alistair Campbell during the Blair years, wasn't it? And I'm sure Dominic Cummings was like that from everything we've heard about him. So I don't think it was much fun working in government anywhere close to number 10 when Dominic Cummings was still there.
Do you think some of the archaic processes, protocols in the House of Commons could or should change?
Oh yeah, for sure. I know it's lovely and it's cool to watch, and I was very lucky actually. I got it because of COVID and all the social distancing. They balloted MPs this year on who could get a ticket to watch any of the Queen's speech, the state opening of Parliament, and I got given a ticket in Central Lobby to watch the procession past from the Commons to the Lords and back again. And I marvel at it, and it is utterly ridiculous, but also wonderful, right? And whilst I don't want us to lose some of that history and tradition, because it's what makes our Parliament what it is, and it makes our country what it is, and it's part of our history. In terms of a working Parliament, there are many parts of it that are just ridiculous. And actually, as a result of COVID, some of that has become a bit more efficient in terms of how we do Parliament. And I really hope some of that will stay. So I'll give you an example. When you watch Parliament and you see people bobbing up and down on the green benches, you don't see that at the moment. There's a reason for that. So in normal times, outside of a pandemic, if you want to speak in a debate, or if you want to ask a supplementary question as a follow-up to a main question that's been drawn in the ballot and that's on the order paper, you do that by standing up and down and catching what they say, catching the speaker's eye. And, if you feel so inclined, he might call on you to ask a question or to speak in a debate. That is massively time wasting. Before March, there were a number of times when I went to try and ask a question, health questions or transport questions or some other departmental question time, and I'm bobbing up and down for an hour after various different questions to try and catch the speaker's eye, and he never called me. Now that's an hour of my time when I could have been dealing with one of those 20,000 emails I talked about, or having a meeting, or actually having 5 minutes downtime to myself. That doesn't happen at the moment because of COVID and because of the hybrid Parliament where you can participate by Zoom or in person. They have these call lists that come out the night before. So everybody who's going to be called to speak, about it in advance, and you know what number you are on the list for any given debate or any given question time. So you can actually plan your time much better. I know this sounds like a basic thing to most of you who work in a professional organisation, but sadly that's not the way Parliament works. And normally, I really, really hope that this will carry on through. It was bonkers in the first lockdown. They trialled remote voting for Parliament so that we could all vote via our computers from home. But Jacob Rees-Mogg thought that meant that we weren't taking our solemn duty of voting in Parliament as seriously as we should. So he scrapped remote voting. So we went back to voting through the division lobbies when they realised that wasn't great in terms of public health. We can now do proxy voting. But proxy votes were only very recently introduced. If you were pregnant and having a baby and on maternity leave, you were never allowed as an MP. You couldn't cast your vote, you would have to do something called pairing, whereby, you know, if you're going to vote one way on an issue, then you have to pair with somebody who's going to vote another way, and they won't vote, and then you cancel each other out. I mean, that's ridiculous and archaic. So there are, I hope there are some learnings from COVID about remote participation and sort of organising things better, that I hope and pray the Procedures Committee and other people will allow to stay. But Jacob Rees-Mogg lives in the 18th century, and, you know, as he's the leader of the House of Commons, I suspect he won't, he would object to any of that stuff going through, and most of it has to be voted on by Parliament, and Conservatives have got an 80-seat majority, so it'll be difficult to modernise anything about the way we work.
And I guess kind of linked to that, what's your opinion on MPs' pay?
There's never a good answer to this as an MP. I mean, most people think we're paid far too much. And, you know, obviously we are paid very well compared to your average salary. That said, there are many MPs who, frankly, outside of Parliament could be earning far more. So, you know, I think it's a good salary. I think most of us, not everyone, but most of us work very hard for it. And it's a complete misnomer when people say, oh, you get all of these expenses. They are not to feather our own nest. They are to pay our staff and to run an office. And I mean, I'm a London MP, so obviously I don't have a home in London. But if you're an MP in Inverness, clearly you need a home in London to stay in, a flat or somewhere, or at least pay for a hotel room through the week. And in any other organisation, your company or your organisation would pay for those expenses, because that's something you have to do as part of your job to be able to fulfil it properly. So that's where the sort of second home allowance comes in. Yeah, I mean, I think, frankly, if you want to attract, you know, sometimes I look at other MPs and I'm sorry, this is going to sound terribly arrogant, but there are some MPs who, frankly, I don't think should be there. And I think if we want to attract a really good caliber of politicians, I think we should perhaps look at the salary, but I don't think that's a particularly politically popular thing to do, particularly not at a time like this when people are losing their jobs. So I'm, you know, very comfortable and happy with it. But I think in reality, I don't know how we benchmark actually versus the rest of the world, to be honest. I saw a benchmark of Prime Minister's salaries, because I think Boris Johnson's been complaining he can't live on 150 grand a year. So there was a table in the Sunday Times, I think, a couple of weeks ago, showing that actually it was sort of, we were mid to the sort of lower half of the table in terms of Prime Minister's salaries. I don't know how we fare for MP salaries. Whoever asked that question, what do you think? I don't know who asked that question.
And as we're coming to 9 o'clock, just to finish with then, for people wanting to go into politics, following on from your journey, are there any particular courses or degrees that you think are better suited for people to go into if they want to go into politics?
No, I mean, there is a breed of politician in Parliament who've all done PPE at Oxford, Politics, Philosophy and Economics at Oxford, were very active in the Oxford Union, and then go and work in the political sphere, become special advisors, and then generally become either Conservative or Labour MPs, and then end up in government at some point. That's one narrow path, and unfortunately there's an overrepresentation of those people. I say unfortunately not because they're bad or anything, but I think we need greater diversity in Parliament, not just in terms of ethnicity and gender, but greater diversity in terms of backgrounds. It's not often you come across an MP who doesn't have a degree. There are some, but the vast majority, I would say, are degree educated. And I would say there isn't any particular degree. I didn't study politics. I studied French and German at university. Yes, I did politics A-level, which is what got me interested, but you certainly don't have to have studied politics. And there's people with all sorts of professional backgrounds, lawyers, medics, teachers, campaigners, you know, Angela Rayner's a care worker. You know, there's all sorts of people in Parliament. And I don't think there is any given route. And as I said earlier, I think if you are serious about getting involved in politics and perhaps building a career in politics, I think it's really valuable to have a career in something else first, as I did, because I think it gives you, you know, a whole load more insights and experience. That said, it's good to have young people in Parliament as well, and clearly just by dint of their age they wouldn't necessarily be able to have another career first, and we do have some very young parliamentarians in their early 20s, early to mid 20s as well, and that's good because it's important that young people's voices are heard more in Parliament and in policy making.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Munira, and thank you all for joining us this evening, and all for your questions. Munira, if you get a chance to have a look in the chat, lots of people are saying thank you very much for all of your insights. For everybody watching, please do look out for our next session, which will be with Asif Khan, who is a London-based award-winning architect who has worked most recently on the Museum of London, and this will be in July, so please do look out for it. And just before we let you go, Munira, just a few final words, please. Thank you.
Oh, from me? Oh gosh, I didn't realise
you get the final say before we.
Goodness me, I think everything that's had to be said has been said, but you know, I guess thank you again for having me. And you know I'm a strange breed, but you know, as a politician, and also particularly as a Liberal Democrat, but it's wonderful to be there and flying the flag. And I hope many of you, well, if you're going to ask me to make a pitch, I'm going to say, you know, join the Liberal Democrats and come and help me get re-elected or get stuck in your local area. And if you want to know how to get involved, get in touch and I'll put you in touch with the right people. We're always looking for more people to get out campaigning and standing for council and other things. So there we go. You did ask me to make a final pitch, so that's it. It's going to be a political one.
Well, hopefully some people will take you up on that offer.
Yeah, if you believe in freedom of the individual, equality of opportunity, community and internationalism, we're the party for you, and aspiration and business, which is also important, as well as social justice. The two go hand in hand.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for joining us. Have a wonderful evening.
Great, thank you.
Take care.